On the second afternoon of October 1887, a picture bride named Sunok Pak stood alone on the plank floor of the Split Rock relay station, a photograph of a stranger folded inside her glove. The stagecoach line held the only road out, and its agent held every excuse he needed to leave without her. Everyone at that station reckoned she would wait there until the next run, 2 days off, or not at all before the passes closed. What rode out of Cottonwood Bend instead, on a horse nobody expected to see saddled that late in the day, would be spoken of at that ranch for the rest of both their lives. She had crossed an ocean for this address, and the address had failed to arrive. The agent at Split Rock had already unhitched his team by the time she understood, through his clipped words and the shake of his head, that the connecting coach to Cottonwood Bend was not coming back for her that day. 20 miles of open range separated her from a man she had met only in a photograph 11 years out of date, a man named Caleb Whitfield who had sent for a wife the way other ranchers sent for seed grain, out of necessity rather than romance. She set her bundle down on the station steps and did not cry, because crying had never once solved anything on the ship, and she doubted it would solve anything here. Word reached Split Iron Ranch by a boy sent ahead on a lathered pony, and Caleb Whitfield heard it standing in his own dooryard with a branding iron still warm in his hand. His younger brother Ross said the obvious thing, that she could wait for Thursday's coach like anyone else, that a bride bought sight unseen from a photograph didn't warrant a man dropping his work at dusk. Caleb set the iron down without answering him, saddled the gray gelding himself, and told the boy Ellery to fetch a second bedroll, because he had decided already that he would not let a woman he had sent for freeze 20 miles short of the door he'd promised her. By the time Caleb reached Split Rock, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and the station agent was already telling him the Korean girl had asked, twice, in careful English, whether there was a horse she might rent to make the distance herself. He found her standing at the fence rail counting fence posts, as if counting might make the ranch appear sooner. He did not offer her the saddle. He swung down, looped the reins over his arm, and told her that 20 miles was a long walk for one person and a shorter one for two, and that he intended to make it beside her rather than watch her ride it alone into a storm he could already feel building in his shoulder. The wind came sideways across the relay yard, carrying grit and the smell of coming snow, and Sunok Pak stood with her cloth bundle pressed against her chest and watched the two figures approach through it, as though they had been conjured out of the gray. She had counted the fence posts 3 times already, 41 from the station door to the corral gate, because counting gave her hands something to do that was not shaking. The stagecoach was gone. It had left an hour before Caleb arrived, its driver citing the weather and the mail contract and a schedule that did not bend for one late connection from Cheyenne, and Maddie Kepler, the agent's widowed sister who ran the Split Rock desk in her brother's absence, had said it plainly enough that Sunok understood every word despite her uncertain English. There would be no second coach until the roads cleared, and that might be after Christmas. Sunok had asked, twice, whether a horse could be rented, whether she might ride the distance alone rather than wait in a room that smelled of coal oil and old wool. Maddie had looked at her the way people had looked at her since San Francisco, assessing, faintly amused, and said there was no horse to spare for a girl who had never sat a saddle. So Sunok had gone back to the fence rail and counted posts and watched the sky change color, and when the man finally came around the bend on a big bay gelding, trailing a second horse she would later learn he had brought only in case she could not walk, she did not know yet that he was the one she had crossed an ocean for. He was larger than the photograph. That was the first thought, plain and unadorned, before any other feeling arrived. The photograph in her cloth bundle showed a younger face, softer at the jaw, a man who might have been 23 when the tintype was made, standing stiff in a coat that did not fit him easily. The man swinging down from the bay in front of her now had 11 more years pressed into his face, a weathering around the eyes that no young man carried, and a stillness to him that made the station yard feel smaller. He did not smile. He did not extend his hand. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fact he has already accepted, and he asked Maddie, in a voice pitched low and even, whether the coach driver had left any word about when the next run might come through. Maddie said what she had already said to Sunok, with less patience this time, and something passed over the man's face that was not quite anger but was close enough to it that Maddie took a half-step back toward her desk. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned from the window and looked at Sunok directly for the first time, taking in the bundle, the coat too thin for the wind, the careful stillness of a woman who had learned to hold herself very quietly in rooms where she was not wanted. He told Maddie he would take his wife on to split iron himself, and the word wife landed strangely in the cold air, a claim staked without ceremony, and Maddie's mouth pulled into something between a smirk and a warning as she said the girl couldn't very well walk 20 miles in that coat. Caleb did not answer her. He crossed the yard to where Sunoke stood, stopped a respectful distance away, and studied the sky over her shoulder for a long moment before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she expected from a man his size, and he spoke slowly, the way a person speaks to someone they are not certain understands them, though she caught every word and resented, faintly, the assumption beneath the care. He said his name was Caleb Whitfield, that he was sorry the coach had left her, that the ranch was 20 miles north and the weather was turning, and he did not intend to leave her at Split Rock through a storm, waiting on a schedule that might not come for weeks. He gestured to the second horse, said she was welcome to it if she could ride, and when she admitted, with the particular embarrassment of a woman raised in a merchant's house in Incheon, where horses were for other people, that she had never sat one, he did not laugh or sigh the way she had braced for. He simply nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he already suspected, and said that 20 miles was a long walk for one person and a shorter one for two, and that he intended to make it beside her rather than watch her ride it alone into weather he could already feel building in his own shoulder. She did not understand the last part of that sentence, not then, and did not ask. He looped the spare horse's lead over his arm along with the bay's reins, took her bundle from her without asking permission, a gesture she stiffened against on reflex before she saw that he only meant to carry it, not to inspect it, not to judge the meager weight of everything she owned, and set off toward the north road at a pace measured to hers rather than his own. Maddie called something after them about the folly of it, about storms and scents, and Caleb did not turn around. Sunoke fell into step beside him, aware of the 11 years the photograph had not shown her, aware of the silence that seemed to be his natural country rather than a rudeness aimed at her, and aware, underneath both, of a small and unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the coat she did not have, and everything to do with the plain fact that he had ridden out into weather to fetch her himself, rather than sending a hand, rather than leaving her to wait on Maddie Kepler's schedule and Maddie Kepler's opinion of picture brides who did not know how to ride. They had gone perhaps a mile when the wind gusted hard enough to rock the horses sideways, and Sunoke saw Caleb's free hand rise involuntarily to his left shoulder, pressing flat against the coat there for the space of 2 breaths, before he let it fall again, his jaw tightening in a way he clearly hoped she had not seen. She had seen it. She said nothing, filing the gesture away the way she filed away everything in those first hours, a woman cataloging a stranger's habits, because habits were the only true information available to her, more honest than the photograph, more honest than the vows they would eventually say in front of a reverend who might or might not approve of her. She studied him instead in the safer, sideways way a woman raised to modesty had learned to study anything. A glance, a return to the road ahead, another glance a few minutes later to add to what she already knew. The photograph had shown a jaw less weathered, eyes that had not yet learned to watch a horizon the way his did now, constantly, without seeming to try. She asked him, when the silence had stretched long enough that asking felt less like an intrusion than a mercy, how old the photograph was, and he said 11 years, flat, as if the number itself embarrassed him. She asked what he had done in those 11 years, expecting perhaps an account of cattle and fences and the ordinary business of a ranch, and instead he said, after a pause long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, that he had ridden for the Rangers out of Texas for 6 of those years before his father's health failed and called him home to Wyoming. He did not elaborate, she did not press, though the phrase rearranged something in her understanding of the silence beside her, not the silence of a dull man or an unkind one, but the particular quiet of someone who had spent years in work that did not reward talking. She thought of the shoulder again, the involuntary hand rising to it, and wondered if the two things were connected, though she lacked yet the vocabulary, in English or in the careful arithmetic of a new marriage, to ask a stranger about old violence on a public road in front of 2 horses and a gathering storm. The land around them had begun to change character as they walked, the relay station's scrubby flats giving way to long swells of grass silvered by the wind, and far off, barely visible, a line of dark timber that Caleb said marked the creek bottom near Split Iron's north pasture. He pointed with his chin rather than his hand, both of his hands occupied with the horses, and told her that the ranch had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that, one of the first outfits to run cattle in this stretch of the territory when the grass was still unclaimed and the winters had not yet taught anyone what they were capable of. She asked carefully, who would inherit such a ranch if he had no son yet? And the question was not idle. She had learned enough in Inchin about property and family lines to know that a marriage arranged across an ocean was rarely only about the two people entering it. Caleb's mouth tightened before he answered, and when he did, his voice had gone flatter, more careful, the tone of a man choosing which parts of a long resentment to hand to a stranger on a first day. His younger brother Ross, he said, had assumed for years that split iron would pass to him, since Caleb had shown no interest in marrying, had in fact avoided it deliberately through his 20s and into his 30s, content to run the ranch alone with hired hands and let the town gossip about him as it pleased. Ross had built a life around that assumption, a wife of his own, a house half-financed on the expectation of land that was not yet his, and the letter Caleb had sent away for a bride, arranged through a broker and a photograph and a correspondence that Sunoke herself had lived on the other end of for 8 months, had apparently landed in the Whitfield household like a shot across a still yard. He said this without elaboration, without asking for her sympathy or offering an apology for the trouble his choice might cause her, and Sunoke understood, in the plain arithmetic of it, that she had was walking literally at that moment, into a family where her arrival diminished someone else's inheritance, where her very existence as his wife was already a grievance to at least one person she had not yet met. She thought of the deed to the ranch, a piece of paper she had never seen and would probably never hold in her own hands by any law she understood, and of the name Whitfield, and of how completely her situation depended on the goodwill of a silent man she had known for the length of one cold afternoon. He held the deed, he held the name. For 20 miles in every direction he was, as far as she could tell, the only shelter that existed, the only law, the only roof. It was not a comfortable thought, walking beside a man whose power over her circumstances was so total, but she noted, too, the plain fact that he had ridden out for her himself, instead of sending Ross or a hired hand, that he carried her bundle and matched his stride to hers, and had said, without performance, that he meant to walk this distance at her side, rather than let her ride it alone. Whatever else was true about the imbalance between them, he had not yet used it against her, and in the strange new mathematics of her life that counted, for now, as something. They walked on, and after a while Caleb said, almost to himself, in a voice gone suddenly distant, that his mother had walked this same stretch of road once, and then he closed his mouth over whatever came next, the sentence left standing open like a door he had not meant to push, and did not finish it, no matter how long Sunoke waited beside him for the rest. The wind found a new edge as the light began to fail, and Sunoke pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders, watching her own breath turn to smoke in front of her. Caleb had not finished his sentence about his mother and the road, and she had decided, in the private arithmetic she kept of him, not to press it. Not yet. Not while the sky to the north had gone the color of a bruise, and the grass had stopped bending in one direction and begun bending in all of them at once. She asked instead, because the silence had grown too large to walk inside comfortably, what waited for her in Cottonwood Bend besides the ranch. Caleb was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, and when he did, his voice had the flat, careful quality of a man reciting something he had turned over many times alone. "There is a woman named Delphine Ross," he said. "She is not kin to me by blood, only by the accident of her daughter marrying into a family that neighbors mine, but she has buried 2 husbands and outlived 3 feuds, and she runs the town's opinion of people the way other women run a kitchen, with total authority and no patience for anyone else's recipe." Sunoko turned the name over. She asked whether this Delphine Ross would be unkind to her. Caleb did not soften it, which she was already coming to understand was simply how he spoke, without the padding some men use to cushion a hard truth before setting it down. "She has never yet approved of a bride who wasn't raised within 40 miles of this valley," he said, "and she said it about my own mother once, and she will say it about you, and there is no use pretending otherwise before you've even met her." Sunoke felt something settle low in her chest, not quite fear, closer to the sensation of watching a storm confirm itself on the horizon after suspecting it for an hour. She thought of the 8 months of letters she had exchanged with this man through the broker, careful sentences in 2 languages passed through a third, and how none of them had mentioned a woman named Delphine Ross or the particular shape of the disapproval waiting at the end of the journey. She asked, because it seemed the only useful question left, whether the other founding families shared this woman's opinions or merely tolerated them. Caleb's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "Where Delphine goes," he said, "the opinion generally follows a week later, dressed up as everyone's own idea." They walked on while the light thinned further, and Sunoke found herself building a picture of this Delphine Ross out of the scraps Caleb offered, a woman with the town's whole memory kept somewhere behind her eyes, ledgering every bride who had ever arrived from somewhere else, and finding each one wanting by some standard that seemed to shift depending on who needed shifting it. She asked, carefully, whether Delphine had said anything in particular about his mother, since Caleb had let that sentence die earlier on the road, and she had not forgotten it even while pretending to. Caleb's jaw worked once, the only sign he gave that the question had landed somewhere tender. "Later," he said, "not tonight." Sunoke did not push it a second time, though she noted the promise inside the refusal, later implied a when, implied that this silence had a door in it somewhere, even if he wasn't opening it now, and she filed that alongside the other unfinished things he had given her since morning. The wound in his shoulder, the horse he had refused for himself, the single sentence about a road his mother had walked once. Snow began then, not the scattered warning flurries of an hour before, but a real fall, fat, unhurried flakes that caught in her eyelashes and softened the hard line of the horizon until the whole world seemed to draw its edges in closer around the two of them. Caleb glanced up at the sky the way she imagined he might glance at a man he didn't trust across a room, sizing it, and said they had perhaps 2 hours of light, and considerably less than that of easy walking left in them before the ground turned treacherous. Sunoke asked, because it seemed important to know exactly what she was walking toward, whether there would be a place to shelter before then. "There is a line shack," he said, halfway, "if the roof's still holding. My father built it the same year he broke the branding iron that gave split iron its name, bent it clean trying to work a bull that didn't want working, and rather than melt it down and start over, he just kept it bent, and named the ranch after the mistake." Sunoke almost smiled at that, the first unguarded thing he had told her all day that wasn't a warning, and she thought that perhaps a man who named his home after his father's stubborn error rather than hiding it might, in time, be a man capable of being known. The snow thickened as if in answer, and Caleb quickened his pace without seeming to hurry, and Sunoke matched him, already understanding, without being told, that whatever Delphine Ross thought of her would have to wait behind whatever the sky was about to do first, and that Caleb was already, in some private register she could not yet read, thinking as far ahead as December, and a founder's social he had not yet described to her at all. The line shack proved smaller than its promise, a single room of gray timber with a stove in one corner and a roof that had held, mostly, against some but not all of the weather it had seen since anyone last used it. Caleb went to the woodbox first, working the kindling with his right hand while his left stayed close to his body, in a way Sunoke had begun to notice without meaning to, a stillness held around the shoulder, the way a person holds still around a bruise they don't want touched. He struck the match one-handed too, cupping the flame with a practiced economy of motion, and she watched him feed the small fire with the patience of a man who had built 100 fires in 100 worse places and no longer needed to think about any part of the process except the part that mattered. When the fire had caught properly and thrown its first real warmth into the room, she asked, without preamble, what was wrong with his shoulder. He did not answer immediately, which by now she recognized as its own kind of answer, and she added that she had seen him favor it since the depot, since before that even, since he had swung down off his horse at Split Rock with a stiffness that had nothing to do with the cold. "Old wound," he said finally, feeding another piece of wood into the stove. "It aches before weather." Sunoke considered this, sitting on the edge of the shack's single cot with her hands still stinging from the last hour of walking, and said that weather had been coming all day, and he had not once mentioned it until she asked. Caleb glanced at her then, something crossing his face that might have been the beginning of respect, or might simply have been surprise that she had pressed twice on a thing most people let go after one deflection. "It's not a conversation I have easily," he said, which was not an answer either, but it was closer to honest than what had come before it, and Sunoke decided that for tonight it would have to be enough. She held her hands toward the stove and found that 2 of her fingers had gone from red to a waxy, unfeeling white, and when she flexed them, the movement came slow and clumsy, more suggestion than command. Caleb noticed before she said anything, crossing the small room in 2 steps and taking her hand in his without asking permission, turning it toward the firelight with the same unhurried care he'd given the kindling. "Frostbite starting," he said, in the same flat voice he used for everything, though his hands moved with more gentleness than his voice suggested, working her numbed fingers slowly between his own broader ones to coax the blood back into them without the sudden shock of direct heat that she knew, distantly, from some remembered warning of her grandmother's, could do more damage than the cold itself. It hurt in the particular way that thawing hurts, a deep prickling ache that made her breath catch, and Caleb, watching her face, said only that the hurting meant it was working, that the danger was in fingers that felt nothing at all. He shrugged out of his coat then and pulled a spare shirt from his saddlebag, wrapping it twice around her hand like a bandage, his motions economical and unembarrassed, a man doing a necessary thing rather than a tender one, though Sunoke felt it as tenderness regardless, felt the strange dislocation of being cared for by a stranger's hands in a stranger's shack 20 miles from anywhere she could yet call home. As he worked the makeshift wrapping snug, his own sleeve rode up past his forearm and higher, and the firelight caught, for just a moment, the puckered old scar at the meeting of his shoulder and collarbone, a mark she had only guessed at before and now saw plainly, a small, violent history written in skin gone silver-white with age. She asked, before she could think better of asking a second question in one night, how he had gotten it. Caleb's hands did not stop their work on the bandage, but something in his face closed, not unkindly, more like a door pulled to without being locked. "Earning this ranch back," he said, and nothing more, tying off the wrapped shirt with a small firm knot and setting her hand gently in her lap as though the conversation too had just been tied off and set down. Sunoke looked at him in the firelight, at the shoulder he had carried all day without complaint, across 20 miles of frozen ground, at the debt folded inside those 4 words that he clearly had no intention of unfolding further tonight, and she understood that whatever had happened to put that scar there was tied, somehow, to Split Iron itself, to the name and the land and perhaps to the very story about his mother that he had also refused to finish on the road. She did not ask again. She only watched the fire find its rhythm and listened to the wind working at the shack's old timbers, and waited, the way she was already learning to wait with this silent man, for whatever he decided, in his own time, to give her next. The fire had burned down to a low, steady red when Caleb finally spoke again, and Sunoke understood without being told that whatever came next was the thing he had been circling since the road. He sat with his forearms on his knees, his bad shoulder angled toward the warmth, and he watched the coals rather than her when he began. "My mother came out from Ohio the same way you came from Pusan," he said. "Different ocean, same kind of crossing. She was 19 too, and she had a name for this valley in her head that didn't match what she found when she got here." Sunoke drew her bandaged hand into her lap and said nothing, learning already that silence was the only door that opened him further. "My grandfather didn't approve of her," Caleb went on. "Said a bride ordered sight unseen from back east wasn't worth the postage. He sent the buggy for her to Cheyenne. Same as I brought a horse for you. Except when word came she was delayed 2 days on the rail, he told the driver not to wait. Left her standing at Split Rock, same as Maddie Kepler left you standing there today." Sunoke's breath caught, not loud, just a small catch in the cold air, and Caleb heard it and kept going anyway, as though he had promised himself he would finish this once he started, or not begin at all. "She walked," he said, "alone. No husband coming for her, because my father didn't know she'd been left. Didn't hear until a rider from the relay station finally got word to Split Iron 2 days later. By then she'd already done the 20 miles by herself, in worse snow than tonight, wearing shoes made for a rail platform and not for drifts." The fire popped, and Sunoke watched the side of his face, the jaw set hard in a way that had nothing to do with anger at her and everything to do with something much older. "She lost 2 fingers to the frost," Caleb said, holding up his own hand and touching the last 2 fingers of his left with the forefinger of his right, like he was marking the exact place on a map only he could see. Left hand. She could still sew, still cook, still do most everything, but she never wore gloves again without folks noticing, and my grandfather's people made sure everyone in town knew whose fault it wasn't. His voice didn't rise, it only went flatter, the way ice goes flatter and harder the longer the cold holds. "That's the family I was born into," he said. "That's the name on the deed you're about to live under." Sunoke sat very still, turning the story over the way she might turn a stone found in a riverbed, looking for the vein of it, the reason he had waited until the coldest hour of the coldest night to hand it to her. "Why tell me this now?" she asked, and her voice came out quieter than she meant it to, swallowed almost immediately by the small room. Caleb was a long moment answering, long enough that she thought perhaps he wouldn't, and then he said, "Because I walked out to Split Rock today knowing exactly what that road does to a woman nobody bothered to wait for, and I wasn't going to let it happen twice under my name." It wasn't chivalry, the way he said it, wasn't performance for her benefit. It landed instead like a debt finally being paid on a note that had been sitting unpaid for 30 years. And Sunoke felt the weight of that shift, something in her chest, some guarded place she had kept locked since San Francisco, since the agent at the depot who wouldn't meet her eyes. She thought of the 11-year-old photograph folded in her bundle, of the stranger she had expected and the man who had instead walked beside her step for step through snow that was, by his own account, kinder than the snow his mother had crossed alone. "Is she still at Split Iron?" Sunoke asked. "Your mother?" The question dropped into the room and Caleb's face did the thing it had done twice already tonight, that small closing, except this time it didn't close on a door pulled to, it closed the way a hand closes over something that still hurts to touch. He looked at the fire a long while before he answered, and when he didn't answer at all, not directly. "She's buried up past the north pasture, under the cottonwoods," he said, and stood, reaching for another split log though the fire didn't yet need one, busying his hands with the small necessary work of tending it so that he wouldn't have to sit still inside the grief a moment longer. Sunoke understood then, watching him crouch and feed the flames with his back half turned to her, that she had walked into the one room in his history he had not meant to open all the way, and that whatever came next between them would carry the shape of a woman neither of them had ever met, a woman who had died with 2 missing fingers, and a story that made her son choose, 20 years later, to walk rather than ride. She did not press him further, she only shifted closer to the warmth he was building, and let the quiet settle back over the shack, the wind outside working steadily at the timbers, carrying, she thought, some echo of a road walked once before in worse snow than this. They came down out of the last stand of timber into the split iron yard just as the sky was turning the pale iron gray of true dawn, and Sunoke saw the ranch for the first time the way a soldier might see the end of a long march. Not clearly, not yet with any real understanding of its shape, only as a place where the walking finally stopped. The house sat low and long against the base of a ridge, smoke already rising thin from one chimney, and beyond it the pens and the barn and a scatter of outbuildings dusted white with the night's snow. Her legs had gone past aching into a kind of distant numbness, and she was aware of Caleb's hand steadying her elbow more than she was aware of her own feet finding the ground. A hired man came out from the barn at the sound of the horse and stopped, staring, and by the time they reached the porch steps 2 more had gathered, drawn by something in the air that told them this homecoming was not an ordinary one. The door of the house opened before Caleb reached it, and a younger man stepped out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves despite the cold, dark-haired where Caleb was fair, built leaner but with the same set to his shoulders that marked them as kin. His eyes went first to Caleb, taking in the exhaustion and the snow crusted along his coat, and then to Sunoke, and whatever softness might have lived in his face for his brother's sake did not extend an inch further. "So the coach couldn't be bothered to bring her the last stretch," the man said, and it wasn't a question. "Ross," Caleb said, low, a warning folded into the single syllable. Ross didn't seem to hear it as a warning. He came down 2 of the porch steps, close enough that Sunoke could see the map of contempt drawn plain across his face, an expression she recognized instantly for what it was because she had seen its cousin on the depot agent's face in Cheyenne, on the faces of strangers on the rail platform in San Francisco, the particular blankness men wore when they had already decided a person's worth before she opened her mouth. "You walk 20 miles in a snowstorm for a woman you've known 8 months through letters and 1 old photograph," Ross said to his brother, like the fact of the walking itself was evidence of some foolishness rather than its opposite. "That's not devotion, Caleb. That's a man throwing good sense after a bad bargain." Sunoke stood where she had stopped at the base of the steps, her bundle still clutched in her bandaged hand, and she made herself hold Ross Whitfield's gaze rather than drop it, though every practiced instinct from a childhood of bowing to elders and strangers alike told her to look away. She had come too far and walked too many miles that night to spend what remained of her dignity flinching from a man who had not yet troubled to learn her name. Caleb moved then, not quickly, but with a finality that stilled the whole yard, stepping down off the last porch stair so that he stood between his brother and the horse, angling his body so Ross's words would have to pass him to reach her at all. He didn't raise his voice. That was, soon okay would come to understand, never his way. His anger ran cold and level, and it was that very evenness that made the hired hands along the barn wall go quiet and still. "This is my wife," Caleb said, and the word landed with a weight that had not been spoken aloud until that moment. Not by him, not to anyone, and soon okay felt it settle over her like a second coat against the cold. "She is mistress of this house, same as our mother was, same as any Whitfield bride before her, and any man on this ranch who can't manage his manners around her is welcome to draw his wages and go find work somewhere that suits him better." He looked at Ross when he said the last of it, and Ross's jaw worked once, twice, some retort rising and then thinking better of itself under the flat weight of his brother's stare. "Unsaddle the horse," Caleb said to him, not as a request. Ross didn't move for a long moment, and then he laughed, short and without humor, and turned back toward the porch instead, leaving the horse standing steaming in the cold. "I'll leave that to the men you still trust to do an honest job," he said over his shoulder, and took the porch steps 2 at a time, disappearing into the house and letting the door fall shut hard enough to rattle the frost on the window pane. One of the hired hands came forward quickly then to take the reins, murmuring something apologetic that Caleb waved off with a tired hand, and soon okay watched Ross's shape move past the front window inside, saw him snatch his coat from a peg, saw him say something sharp to no one in particular before shouldering back out through the rear of the house toward the stable where a second horse waited. "Where's he going?" soon okay asked quietly, and Caleb followed her look toward the stable, his face gone unreadable in the flat morning light. "Into town, most likely," he said, "to tell Delphine Ross there's a bride at Split Iron worth talking about before the week's even out." The days after Ross rode for town settled into something soon okay had not expected to find at Split Iron, a rhythm rather than a battle. Caleb went out before light to the herds and came back after dark smelling of cold and horse and wood smoke, and in between those hours the house belonged to her, its rooms cold in the corners and warm near the stove, its cupboards half bare in the way of a house that had gone years without a woman's hand in it. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her knees the second morning and found, under the dust behind the flour bin, a boy's carved wooden horse missing one ear, and she was still turning it over in her palm when the boy himself came through the back door stamping snow from his boots. He was small for 9, all elbows and watchful eyes, and he stopped when he saw her holding his horse as though caught between wanting it back and wanting to see what she would do with it. Soon okay held it out to him without a word, and he took it, and did not leave. His name was Ellery Doss, Caleb told her later, an orphan out of a burned homestead 2 winters back that nobody else had room for, and the way Caleb said it made clear the boy had not so much been taken in as claimed, the same plain, unbending way Caleb had claimed her at the depot yard. Ellery did not talk to her the first day, only watched from doorways with the wooden horse in his fist, but by the second he was sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor while she mended a torn cuff, closer than he needed to be for the light. It was the thimble that undid his silence entirely. She always wore it on the 3rd finger of her right hand while she sewed, silver gone soft at the edges from handling, a chrysanthemum etched faint into the band where her grandmother's thumb had once pressed against it. And when Ellery finally spoke, it was to ask, in the blunt way of children, what the flower was, and why it was on a piece of metal too small to be worth anything. She told him it was a mugungwa, though she said it slower for him, and that her grandmother had etched it herself with a nail and a steady hand over the course of one whole winter in a house across an ocean he had never heard of. He asked where that was, and she said Korea, and watched the word land in him like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of 100 more questions he did not yet know how to ask. From that afternoon on, Ellery found reasons to be wherever she was, trailing her from kitchen to henhouse to the mending basket by the window, and soon okay, who had crossed an ocean without a single soul who knew her name, found that his company settled something restless in her chest she had not admitted was there. She told him about Korea in pieces suited to a boy's patience, not the whole of it at once, but small true things, the sound rain made on a tiled roof, the taste of rice cakes at New Year, the way her grandmother's hands had shaken toward the end but never once when she held a needle. Ellery listened with his chin propped on his fists, and asked questions that cut closer than he knew. Why she had left, whether she missed it, whether the thimble was magic, and she answered the last one honestly, that it was not magic, only memory made small enough to carry in a hem, and he liked that answer better than magic would have been. Caleb came in from the barn more than once during those weeks to find them like that, the boy's head bent near her shoulder, her needle catching lamplight, and he would stand a moment in the doorway with his hat still on and something loosen visibly in his face before he remembered himself and hung the hat on its peg, gruff again, asking after supper. She noticed it each time, the way his shoulders dropped half an inch, the way his voice, when he finally spoke, came out softer than the voice he used with the hands or with Ross. It was Ellery, 3 weeks into her stay, who told her without any weight in it at all that he'd seen Ross's horse gone from the stable near every day that week, and that Ross had taken to riding into Cottonwood Bend in the mornings instead of working the south fence line like Caleb had told him to. He said it the way children say things, as an observation about horses and chores and nothing more, adding that Ross always came back smelling of Mrs. Ross's parlor, meaning Delphine, whose house Ellery had once visited with the ranch hands at Christmas and remembered for its clock that chimed too loud. Suno kept her hands steady on the mending as he said it, but something in her stilled all the same, some instinct honed by a lifetime of reading rooms for the shape of trouble before it spoke its name aloud, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time since the yard confrontation, exactly what business kept pulling Ross toward that particular house, and why, though the boy did not understand it, the thought of it settled in her stomach like a stone. The rumors reached Sunoke the way rumors always reach the person they are about, sideways and half-finished, in the pause of a shopkeeper's greeting and the too quick change of subject among women at the mercantile counter. She had ridden into Cottonwood Bend with Caleb on a supply run in the second week of November, standing at the counter with a list of flour and lamp oil in her hand, when she felt the room behind her go quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when they have just been discussing the person who entered it. She did not turn around. She had learned that much crossing an ocean, that turning around only fed a silence, gave it a face to aim at, and so she kept her eyes on the shelves and let the quiet do what it wanted behind her back. It was Delphine Ross who broke it, not with cruelty exactly, but with a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, remarking to no one in particular that it was a strange thing, wasn't it? A marriage bought through letters and a broker's photograph, no family to vouch for the bride, no one in the territory who'd known her people, and wasn't it the kind of arrangement a man ought to look into more carefully before he put his name and his father's ranch behind it? Sunoke's hand did not shake reaching for the flour sack, though everything in her wanted it to. She had met Delphine only once, briefly, in the yard the day after her arrival, a stout gray-haired woman with a face arranged for judgment long before Sunoke ever stepped off a stagecoach, and she understood now, standing in that mercantile with her back to the room, that Ross had done exactly what he'd promised in the yard, ridden straight to Delphine with whatever version of events served him best. The whisper had a shape to it by the time it reached Sunoke's ears in full, that she was no proper bride at all, that the marriage broker's papers were suspect, that no reverend in the territory had yet recorded the union in a register, and that a woman who arrived with nothing but a bundle and an old photograph could be anyone, could be running from anything, and Split Iron's name was too old and too respected to be handed carelessly to a stranger nobody could vouch for. Caleb, when she told him what she'd overheard, went very still in the way she now recognized as his particular kind of anger, the kind that didn't shout, and said only that Delphine Ross had never once needed the truth to build a case against somebody, and that he would deal with it in his own time. But his own time, Sunoke noted with a tightening in her chest, was not now, and the Founders' Social was less than a month away, and a story like this one, once loose in a town the size of Cottonwood Bend, did not wait politely for anyone's convenience. Worse than the whisper itself was what it did to the register. Reverend Amos Cade, a thin, patient man who had married more ranching families than anyone left living in the valley, had not yet formally recorded Sunoke and Caleb's marriage in the town's book, a delay he'd first explained as ordinary caution, the paperwork from the broker needing time to arrive from Cheyenne, nothing to trouble over. But when Sunoke passed him outside the church on a Sunday errand for lamp wicks, his eyes slid away from hers before his mouth managed a greeting, and she understood without being told that Delphine had gotten to him too, that the register would stay unsigned until the town's opinion settled one way or the other, and that a marriage unrecorded was, in the eyes of families like the Rosses, hardly a marriage at all. She walked back to Split Iron that afternoon, turning the thought over with each step, that she had crossed an ocean and walked 20 miles through snow to become a wife in name only, a woman whose place in this valley could be erased with a stroke withheld rather than a stroke made. That night, after Ellery was asleep and Caleb was out checking the herd against an early cold snap, She took the cloth bundle down from the shelf where it had sat untouched since her arrival, the same bundle that had carried her across the Pacific and the width of a continent, and began, quietly, without deciding to, folding into it the few things that were truly hers: the wedding photograph gone soft at its corners, a spare dress, the thread and needles she used for mending. She was not certain, turning each item over in her hands, whether she meant to leave in truth or only needed to know that she still could. That arriving somewhere did not have to mean staying somewhere, that had already decided she was a stain to be scrubbed out before the Founders Social made its judgment public. She had gotten as far as the wedding photograph, holding it to the lamp to look one more time at the 11-year-old face of the man who had since become someone entirely different to her, when she heard boots on the porch stop rather than continue, and turned to find Caleb in the doorway, snow still on his shoulders, looking at the bundle in her hands with an expression she had not seen on him before, something closer to fear than anger. He did not ask what she was doing. He asked, instead, in a voice gone rough at the edges, whether she meant to walk back to Split Rock alone, the same 20 miles, the same road, and something in the careful stillness of the question told her he was not only asking about tonight. Caleb did not answer her question with words. He crossed the room, took the wedding photograph from her hand, and set it face down on the dresser, as though closing a door on it, then told her to put on the altered dress, the one she had let out at the waist herself, with her grandmother's thimble guiding the needle, because they were going to the Founders Social together, tonight, and she was not walking into that hall as a woman with a bundle packed for leaving. Sunoke searched his face for the anger she expected, and found instead something steadier, a decision already made and settled deep, the same stillness he had carried on the walk from Split Rock. She asked him what good it would do to stand in front of Delphine Ross and the whole valley when the register still sat unsigned, when Reverend Cade had not spoken the words that would make the marriage a fact the town could not unmake. Caleb said only that a thing did not become less true for going unrecorded, and that he intended to make it true in front of everyone who mattered, tonight, rather than let Ross and Delphine decide the shape of the story in whispers while he stood by. He saddled 2 horses himself, refusing again to let her walk, and they rode into Cottonwood Bend under a sky gone the color of a healing bruise, the lamplight of the town hall visible a mile off, spilling gold across the snow like something already burning. Ellery came with them, bundled to the chin, riding before Caleb on his saddle and clutching his one-eared wooden horse, too young to understand why the ride felt like something braced against, but old enough to reach back once and take hold of Sunoke's sleeve when they passed the turnoff toward Delphine Ross's house, as if he meant to anchor her there beside him. At the hall's doors, the fiddle music inside stopped only when the doors themselves opened, not before, so that Caleb and Sunoke walked in on the tail end of a reel, the dancers still turning, the room bright with lamps and pine boughs, and the particular cruelty of a place built for celebration. Every face that found them held the same fraction of a second, recognition, calculation, and then the careful blankness people wear when they have already decided what they think of someone and are only waiting for permission to say it aloud. Caleb did not pause at the threshold. He walked Sunoke the full length of the hall on his arm, past tables of preserves and pie, past the ranching families who had known his mother and his father and buried them both, straight toward the raised platform where Reverend Cade stood beside the town ledger, open on its stand as it was every December for births and marriages recorded before witnesses. Delphine Ross rose from her chair near the front before they had gone 10 steps, smoothing her skirts with the unhurried authority of a woman who had never once in 30 years lost an argument in this hall, and the room's low murmur folded itself into the kind of silence that waits to see who will strike first. Delphine Ross let the silence stretch until it had done its work, then asked, in a voice pitched to carry to the back tables, whether the town register would finally be corrected, since she understood from Reverend Cade that no marriage had actually been recorded, that what stood before them tonight was, by the town's own law, a housekeeper wearing a bought dress. A ripple went through the room, not laughter exactly, but its cousin, the sound of people deciding it was safe to be entertained. Sunoke felt Caleb's arm go rigid under her hand, but he did not raise his voice, and that, more than anger would have, seemed to unsettle Delphine, who had built 30 years of authority on the expectation that she would always be answered louder than she spoke. Caleb said that Delphine was right about one thing, that the register was unsigned, and that he intended to fix that tonight, but that before he did, the Hall was owed the truth about why Ross Whitfield had spent the better part of 2 months riding into town most mornings instead of working the south fence, and why the rumors about a fraud bride had started precisely then and nowhere else. He turned, found his brother standing near the punch table with his hat already half raised as if to leave, and told him plainly, in front of every family in the valley, to stay and hear the rest since he'd gone to such trouble starting it. Ross did not sit. He stood with his jaw working and said nothing, which Caleb seemed to take as answer enough, because he turned next to the room at large and told them a story most of them had never heard in full, though half of them had lived beside its ending without knowing it. He told them his mother, Margaret Whitfield, had come to this valley 30 years before as an outsider bride from Ohio, sent for the same as Sunoke had been, and that his father's family, Delphine's own circle among them, had judged her unworthy before she'd so much as stepped off the coach, and had left her at Split Rock Relay Station on a December night worse than the one that had nearly taken Sunoke, so that she walked the 20 miles alone, in the dark, and arrived at Split Iron having lost 2 fingers to the frost, fingers she wore gloved for the rest of her life, so the valley would not have the satisfaction of seeing the cost of what it had done. He said he had grown up hearing that story told as a caution against outsider brides, when it had never been anything but a record of cruelty the town preferred to misname. He said that when word reached him the coach had left Sunoke 20 miles short, he had understood exactly what was about to happen to her, because it had already happened once under his family's name, and he had ridden out that night to make certain history did not get to repeat itself while he stood by and let it. The hall had gone entirely silent by the time he finished, silent enough that the fire in the hearth was the loudest sound in the room, and Reverend Cade, who had known Margaret Whitfield in her last years and had said the words over her grave, stepped down from the platform with the register still open in his hands. Reverend Cade set the ledger on a side table where the whole hall could watch, and asked Caleb and Sunoke to come forward and speak their names for the record, a formality he had delayed for weeks under Delphine's quiet pressure, and now performed with the deliberate slowness of a man correcting a debt he had let run too long. Sunoke gave her name the way her mother had taught her to give it, whole and unhurried, Pak Sunok, and heard Reverend Cade write it beside Caleb's in a hand that did not waver, the pen scratching loud in a room that had forgotten how to make any other sound. Delphine Ross had not moved from where she stood near the front table, and when Sunok finally looked at her directly, she found the older woman's face changed from what it had worn minutes before, the satisfaction gone out of it, replaced by something drawn tight around the eyes that might have been shame, or might only have been the recognition of having backed the losing side of a story in front of the very people whose opinion she had spent 30 years commanding. Ross left before the ink was dry, pushing through the hall doors into the cold without his coat, and no one moved to stop him or follow, the room's attention already turned elsewhere, already reassembling itself around the new shape of things. What followed in the weeks after the social came slower than the confrontation itself, the way thaw comes slower than frost. Ross returned to Split Iron 4 days later, riding in at dusk with his hat in his hand rather than on his head, and found Caleb in the barn and Sunoke in the yard hauling water, and he did not make a speech of it, only said he'd been wrong to carry Delphine's opinions as though they were his own, and asked if there was work he could still do on the place he'd once expected to inherit outright. Caleb handed him a curry comb without comment and nodded toward the horses, and that, between the two brothers, passed for the whole of the reconciliation, though Sunoke noticed in the days that followed that Ross took his meals at the long table without complaint now and split wood before being asked, and once, catching her alone in the kitchen, said under his breath that he was sorry for the coach, for the whispers, for all of it, in a voice too quiet for pride to survive in. Delphine Ross did not apologize, not in words, but she stopped speaking against Sunoke in the mercantile, and when the two women passed each other on the boardwalk in the first week of the new year, Delphine inclined her head the smallest fraction, an acknowledgement rather than a greeting, and Sunoke understood it as the only surrender a woman like that would ever offer, and let it be enough. By the middle of January, the first true snow of the season closed the high pass above Cottonwood Bend, the kind of snow that stayed rather than passing through, settling over the fence lines and the cattle pens and the long, low roof of the split iron house until the whole ranch looked pressed under a single, unbroken sheet of white. Caleb had taken to wearing the silver thimble on a leather cord at his collar, tucked beneath his shirt where it rode against his sternum, a habit he had started without announcement one morning after mending a torn cinch strap with Sunoke's needle and thread, and simply never taking it off again. And when she had asked him about it, only once, he had said that a man ought to carry some plain sign of what his wife brought into a marriage, and left it at that, the way he left most things that mattered too much for further explanation. Ellery had grown bold enough by then to ask Sunoke to teach him the stitches her grandmother had used to carve the chrysanthemum into the Thimble's band, and spent long evenings at the kitchen table with a scrap of leather and a borrowed awl, attempting something that was not quite a flower and not quite anything else, proud of it regardless. Sunoke stood in the kitchen doorway on the evening the snow finally stopped, wearing the wedding dress she had altered with her own hands weeks before the social, the one that had been her grandmother's before it crossed an ocean folded inside a cloth bundle, watching the last gray light fail over land that carried the Whitfield name, but that she no longer thought of as belonging to anyone else's history but her own. The kitchen behind her held the ordinary sounds of a house settled into itself, Ellery's awl scraping leather, the stove ticking as it cooled, Caleb's boots crossing the floorboards toward her with the particular unhurried wait she had learned to listen for. He came to stand beside her in the doorway without a word, close enough that she could feel the cold still clinging to his coat from the evening chores, and together they watched the snow gather along the porch rail and settle white across the yard, the barn, the fence posts running out toward pasture that stretched unbroken to the dark tree line beyond. Somewhere past the north pasture, under the cottonwoods, his mother's grave lay quiet beneath the same snow, and Sunoke understood, without being told, that this stillness between them now, this particular kind of quiet, was itself an answer to that old grief, a promise kept in the plainest way a promise could be kept, through years rather than words. She reached up and rested her hand briefly against the thimble's shape beneath his collar, felt him go still at the touch, and then simply stood there beside him as the snow kept falling, steady and complete, over split iron and everything it now held.